looking forward to it. I'm Jim McCarville, and I've got the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight. Our main speaker is a Romanian Byzantine Catholic priest. The Diocese of Pittsburgh was very interested in our choice. Bishop Zubik himself had planned to attend tonight, but he's doing a confirmation, which obviously has been something you can't change in your schedule. But when we told him of our speaker, we got a very, very warm sense of approval of what we're doing, and we were very happy that we could do that. He liked our choice, and I think to get right to the point of our speaker, on the topic of nonviolence or non-existence, we've had a number of very good speakers on violence, religion, and what we need to do about it. I think our speaker tonight is uniquely qualified. He's bringing with him some of the Byzantine perspective of it. Also, I understand it was the Amish and Mennonite neighbors that influenced him so much and led to this kind of career choice. For us, he attracted a lot of attention. He was the first and maybe the only U.S. bishop to really stand up against the first Iraq invasion. And he had the courage to call it safe. Bishop John Michael Botean, who I understand is called Bishop Mike, is going to now, I think, give a very interesting opportunity for us. Thank you very much, Bishop.
Just a little bit of indulgence. The messenger messes up. Try not to let it get in the way of the message, because the message is what's important. And the way I approach this message may be perhaps a little bit different from what so many folks are used to. I'm not good at quoting church documents. Like I said, I'm a frustrated academic, so I can't bring a whole lot of scholarship to it. I can bring some experience. And a lot of my experience has to do with, I'm going to give credit to my spiritual father from the seminary, Father Emmanuel Charles McCarthy. You have heard, anyone who's been to any of his workshops will, okay, this is going to be a rerun, so there won't be any quiz. There won't be any quiz, but you have heard a good deal of this material before. And one of the things that's one of his more recent articles, which is a very good one to read, if you were to go to centerforchristiannonviolence.org, all one word, Center for Christian Nonviolence, he's got this relatively new article to teach what Jesus taught, a call to fidelity. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about tonight. I'm not a politician. If I were, I'd be a very bad one. I don't think I would manage to get elected to anything. But there was a political cartoon, I won't mention, it's a cartoon that appeared that says, Senate, fill in the blank this morning. Sorry. And so it's a picture of a bunch of men sitting around the table, about to begin like a committee meeting, and they said, the caption is, before we discuss raising taxes on the poor and middle class, adding $1 trillion to the deficit, taking health insurance away from 13 million, raising premiums by 10%, defending treason, and swearing in a pedophile, let's begin with a prayer. So I think we can see where the problem is. But before we get to pointing fingers or blaming anybody, let me just say that the problem is, as I put it in the description somewhere, it's just here, I wrote it, that the notion of nonviolence elicits either misunderstanding or non-understanding, or just a big yawn for most people most of the time. Unless you're talking to a person who's a political activist and they know something, like if you've ever heard Gene Sharp, he was back in Boston back in the day, was an expert in the application of political action in terms of using Gandhian and King-style nonviolence. I don't know that, and I wouldn't be very good at it. But I did write this, and that's why I titled this talk, Nonviolence or Non-Existence, Christian Moral Relevance today. The term nonviolence usually elicits either a shrug of indifference or a snort of open hostility from Christians, despite the clearest teaching of Jesus. Shortly before his assassination, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King III famously said, or Jr., I don't know the right side, the third, famously said, "We are at a time when our choice is not between violence and nonviolence, but between nonviolence and non-existence." Apart from its obvious reference to the possibility of world cataclysm in King's day as well as ours, might not his expression also be taken to refer to the danger the church faces of becoming a moral cipher? Has the church lost its voice by ignoring Jesus' teaching of nonviolent active love of friend and enemy? This talk will explore how the salvation of souls must take precedence over fostering, preserving, or promoting a political order in the pastoral activity of the church. With that, I would turn fairly early on to something that Thomas Merton wrote in a letter to Rabbi Everett Gendler in 1962. When he said, I don't know precisely what he was talking about, when he said, at the same time, I am impressed with the fact that all these things are little more than symbols. Thank God they are at least symbols and valid ones. But where are we going to turn for some really effective political action? Thomas Merton says. As soon as one gets involved in the machinery of politics, one gets involved in its demonic futilities and in the great current that sweeps everything toward no one knows what. Now, none of this is to say that standing on a street corner with a sign, or even voting, even though I must confess, with Dorothy Day, I have not considered voting something that I feel entitled to do or ought to do. However, well, I'll save sin and my sins for the confessional. And I won't be asking for absolution from you, but I do ask for God's absolution every once in a while. Because I found myself in this article to teach what Jesus taught, a call to fidelity. And it's a question that perhaps all clergy people, priests, and especially bishops either ask themselves or ought to be asking themselves. Is what I do, and Christians living it, is what I do reflective in any way of the person and teaching of Jesus Christ? There's a quote in here that Father McCarthy was actually, I'll just read the section in here where, they say, put yourself in the story. Well, I found myself very unhappily sitting in this story. Some 25 years ago, a Catholic bishop said to me, "Just war? What just war? No such thing exists. But we must not tell this to the people." Now, at a distance, the easiest judgment to make on this man is that he is a blatant hypocrite, posturing as an authoritative leader of the gospel, when in fact he is intentionally withholding an important dimension of it. But when seen up close, he is a man of intelligence and of more than ordinary compassion. He simply does not see how he, for his people, or a pope and an ecumenical council for the entire church, could teach that Christians cannot follow Jesus by participating in the military, without having nation after nation turn on its Christian population like enraged beasts. That's something that even Pope Francis had to consider on his recent trip to Myanmar. So he had to weigh his words very, very carefully, because there was certainly the tiny Christian Catholic population in Myanmar was certainly under threat. So what do you do about that? And it's the kind of thing that Catholic leaders perhaps think about. But it's so easy to become the Grand Inquisitor from the Brothers Karamazov, if you're familiar with that story, where Jesus appears to the Grand Inquisitor in the story that's within the story of the novel. Grand Inquisitor of the Inquisition, Catholic Inquisition, said, "If you were to come again, Jesus, we would have to kill you all over." And that's pretty much the case. I found another article recently, so forgive me if I'm just reading article after article. Points to some of the issues. The Reverend Francis Colamaria, pastor of St. Helen Roman Catholic Church in Howard Beach, said at an active shooter seminar at the House of Worship Monday that he encouraged those with the legal ability to carry firearms to bring their guns to the pews. If you have a license to carry, I would advise you to carry, Colamarria said at the seminar, adding that the question has been posed to him by parishioners. We live in a very treacherous world. Where does that come from? What mind does that come from? Yes, we live in a very treacherous world. And I wonder when the world has not been treacherous. I wonder when human life has not been easily disposed of by the millions. Part of where it comes from is clear. One of the things that Father Colamarria goes on to say is, the Holy Father has an army, referring to the Swiss Guards and the Gendarmerie at the Vatican, and that's true. They carry everything from hand weapons to automatic weapons, machine guns, as they protect the Pope. Now, understanding the kind of position that Pope Francis is in, or any Pope, especially now, getting rid of something like the Swiss Army or the Swiss Guard or the Vatican Gendarmerie would be very difficult. In fact, his own security detail has told him, inside story, don't ever find yourself alone at the top of a staircase. The world is the way the world is. The church is the way the church is. And humans are the way humans are. And it is a treacherous place. But I would have to say that it's no more treacherous now than it was in the first 300 years of Christian existence. When, at a time that it was just as socially advantageous and safe to be a Christian as it was to be a Jew in Nazi Germany, the church not only did not die, despite the effort, more or less, not consistent, but 3 good persecutions during those first 300 years. The church not only was not exterminated, it grew, until by the time of Constantine the Great, Saint Constantine as he's known in the Byzantine Church, it was the largest religion in the Roman Empire, and became a political force that had to be reckoned with. And Constantine was interested in having the power that he had. When it was a matter of either he or his father having the consulship of the Western Roman Empire, he decided it was going to be him, and he met his father in battle and killed him. Of course, he goes on to become a Christian. And nobody says, even Eusebius doesn't say that he becomes a Christian at any time while he is actively in the empire. He wasn't raised as a Christian. If he was a Christian, he was baptized on his deathbed, and yes, indeed. If he was baptized on his deathbed, he went straight to heaven, and we're not incorrect in calling him Saint Constantine. But that's not why the church has recognized him. They were looking after 300 years of really rough persecution to being able to turn the empire into a Christian phenomenon, to really lead the world by creating the city of God. And 1700 years later, what is your assessment of the success of that endeavor? Lately I've been rather inspired by the example of a young fellow by the name of Joshua Castillo. Some of you have heard of Joshua Castillo. Some of you have met Joshua. Brother Bernie has met Joshua. And he's written a book, it's just now appeared in its 2nd edition, Letters from Abu Ghraib. Joshua was an interrogator at Abu Ghraib. Now, he wasn't assigned there until after the scandal hit and all that kind of stuff. So he wasn't involved in that kind of thing. But he is a very interesting fellow. He was raised an evangelical Christian. And over the course of his time at Abu Ghraib and later, he did become a Catholic, along with his mother. And I think perhaps his sister. While he was an interrogator, though, he was a very deep thinker. He had spent an initial period at West Point. He got a commission, he was admitted there, and then left. Then after 9/11, decided to join the military again, wanted to contribute something, because he was a man of high ideals. And this is what he thought he could contribute. And so he always went further. After spending several years learning Arabic and probably speaking it better than many of the other interrogators, he went further than simply following the book and trying to interrogate these people. He knew that they were all being, a lot of them were being brought in on these just sweeps. Men, boys, being turned in by somebody who had a grudge against them, and so they were turned in as a terrorist. And most of the time, almost all the time, he never encountered a real terrorist and was able to say that. But he did try to establish a rapport with them. And at one point, he established a rapport with one fellow. And he writes home about this experience. Let me read you what he wrote. So I just experienced why it is I am here in Iraq. Other than all the struggles I've been wrestling with, I just, quote, met my reason. A young foreign jihadist who said he might kill me if he had the chance, that is, as long as I'm a U.S. soldier in Muslim lands. The gospel came out of his mouth unwittingly while trying to convert me to Islam. It was beautiful. I was dumbstruck. I left praising Christ and thanking God for this enemy. I confessed to him my sins and asked him to look at his own. I'm certain that this interrogation was not doctrinal by Army standards. Pardon my bluntness, but to hell with the Army and their doctrine. Today was a moment when life mattered. I did not try to justify myself, but instead asked God and my enemy simply for mercy. What is terrifying is that this jihadist genuinely wanted my conversion, for me to see the emptiness of, quote, American beauty. He talked of the peace and happiness I would find in, quote, true religion. And I felt him actually care for me, desire for my good. I asked him why he came to Iraq to kill, and then he asked me why I did. Your Lord, our prophet Isa, Jesus, tells you to turn the other cheek, to love those who hate you. Why do you not do this? I replied, you're right, and then asked him when he would go and do likewise. He said, vengeance was his right. I lacked the power to challenge him in any way that I did not challenge myself, because such ideas of love and forgiveness and compassion are not fully manifest and incarnate in me, tangibly and practically, to be seen and felt. As if to say, look at the love I give you. After all was said and done, we ended with a feeling of mutual respect. I left and I prayed I would be given the chance to see him one day in the future when I could say, I left that world behind, so can you. That began a process for Joshua in which he was eventually convinced that he could no longer stay in the military, and he applied for release from the military as a conscientious objector. And unlike most people who do that in the military, his commanding officer congratulated him, knew that to be consistent with his personality completely, and offered him every support that he could. And so he got out of the military, and then went on to study more things, including playwriting. And he was a fantastic writer and a great and inspiring speaker that I had the privilege to meet on a couple of occasions. Unfortunately, Joshua died at the age of 35 or 36 of a cancer common to elderly Asian women and soldiers who worked at the burn pits in Iraq, which he did. So his mother established the Joshua Castile Foundation, which is where you can get this book. So that was shameless promotion of the book itself, but the Joshua Castile Foundation, which exists mainly to honor his memory and to go further with carrying his message. And it was his message specifically in another email, I suppose these are, that he sent home that struck me. Because I have to ask myself, why am I so unlike so many other people who are called, and rightly so, peace activists? I'm not sure that I deserve a title like that. But I found an answer that was something close to my feeling. He wrote, as he's getting out of the military, my issue is not, quote, the war in Iraq. It's Christian complicity in sin. It's my complicity in systems of sin and violence. That's kind of where it stands for me, and where I think it stands for the church. According to John L. Mackenzie, former Jesuit, and what was considered the dean of Catholic biblical scholarship in his day, mid-20th century, he said, there's no way that we can conclude anything but that the teachings of Jesus are teachings of nonviolent and active love. There's no way to square anything else within the four corners of the New Testament. It's the clearest of teachings, he says. And certainly that young jihadist saw that. And I don't know that we, reading the Gospels, can actually see anything other than that. And yet we do. And the church does. We have become, in a certain sense, mute when it comes to being able to preach what Jesus preached, teach what Jesus taught. And it comes down to what's up. I have to find these notes. Yes, indeed. Not that one. It doesn't matter. I think God is telling me not to bother with these notes. Today is the feast of St. Ambrose in the Byzantine Church. Actually, it was until sundown, because Byzantine Day starts at sunset, like the Jewish day. And it's a memorial of St. Ambrose in the Latin Rite as well. St. Ambrose was a miracle of grace in the church. St. Ambrose came from the wealthiest family in Milan in his day. He was the pagan dictator of Milan. Milan was the wealthiest city in the Roman Empire. Or as one might put it, Milan was to Rome what New York is to Washington. And Ambrose, St. Ambrose, went from being a non-Christian at a time when the catechumenate lasted a significant period of time, if not years. You have to express your interest in becoming a Christian. And then because in earlier days, the understanding was you could walk out of the baptismal font into the lion's den, you had to be prepared for what it was to be a Christian, because the only thing that you could not do practically as a Christian and not really expect forgiveness was to leave the faith, to apostatize, to deny Christ. And he went from being the pagan dictator of Milan, through whatever he did, the catechumenate, baptism, chrismation or confirmation, and admission to the Eucharist. Eventually ordination through whatever, I'm not exactly sure what degrees of ordination there were in those days, but became the Bishop of Milan in 8 days. Now, the reason that that's interesting is that Milan, of course, Ambrose was the teacher of Augustine. And it was Ambrose, not Augustine, who first articulated in Christian terms this pagan Stoic philosophy, philosophical concept called the just war. Now, the just war was never meant to justify war, but to limit its ferocity. This is among pagans. But it was employed in varying degrees, to the point at which the Synod of Arles later on, I don't have the dates in front of me because they fell on the floor. Well, actually from let's say 311, before the Edict of Milan, and 313, which was the toleration of Christianity, to about 416. In 311, you couldn't be a member of the fighting Roman army if you were a Christian. By about 416, under the emperor, I think it was Theodosius, you couldn't be a member of the fighting Roman army unless you were a Christian. So in the space of barely over 100 years, things changed rather drastically. And then the Synod of Arles later on said, if you're a priest, you cannot use a spear in war, only a club. And while we're talking about terrorism and infidels and going straight to heaven, the first and only for the longest time plenary indulgence in the Catholic Church, at a time when indulgences were a big part of the European economy, was for fighting in the Crusades. Right? Now, you didn't have to fight in the Crusades. You could pay somebody else to fight in the Crusades. They got the money, you got the indulgence, all was good. Right? It's a deal. It's a deal. And for fighting Muslims, if you died, you went straight to heaven with this plenary indulgence. And for, like I said, for the longest time, that was the only one, until somebody by the name of Francis of Assisi came along and convinced the Pope to grant a plenary indulgence to people who came to his little portion church, it was called Botean, and prayed. And the Pope granted a plenary indulgence for that, the first one other than fighting in the Crusades. And Francis, simple man that he was, simply sucked the manpower out of the Crusades. Because if you could go without putting your anatomy on the line and get a plenary indulgence, people much preferred that to fighting in the Crusades. But it was Francis who at the same time had the courage to meet the Sultan. He had seen the battle. Of course, the Crusaders were not only killing Muslims, they were killing Christians as well. They invaded Constantinople, desecrated the church there. The cathedral established what was called the Latin Roman Emperor in Byzantium or Constantinople for a while. And the result of that, more than the filioque, more than the fact that we use leavened bread and you use unleavened bread in the Eucharist, more than anything else, accounts for the division between Catholics and Orthodox today, the Crusades. Because the Orthodox have a very long memory, as do the Muslims. So where has that gotten us? Where has this gotten the Christian church trying every way to teach anything other than what Jesus taught in the clearest of his teachings? That Christians are to love, his commandment, love one another as I have loved you. And as he says throughout the New Testament, right? Or throughout the Gospels. I say to you, love your enemies. Jewish theologians and other scripture scholars recognize that expression, love your enemy, as unique to Jesus. It's the explicit reason that Pharisaic Judaism in Jesus' own day and modern Jewish scholars say it simply could not be adopted as Judaism. Simply could not be, and was rejected. Now, if you are a Buddhist and have not been baptized into Christ, do not know Jesus, you're not accountable to following Jesus. If you're a Muslim or a Jew or a non-believer, you're not accountable to following Jesus. But if you, like Peter, say, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, if you say that you are the definitive communication between the origin and source of all that is, and now all that is, I mean, that's a lot. We're about, I think the Earth is about 1/1,000,000th the size of the Sun, which is one of about 100 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, which is one of about 100 billion galaxies in the known universe. We're small. We're very small. In fact, let's say, yes. Okay. Now let's say, there we go. That's the roundest I've ever made. Can anybody see that? It's a circle. Now, say that this is everything that ever was. And everything that is. The past, the present, the future, the macrocosm, the microcosm, the stars, the suns, the galaxies, the atoms, subatomic particles, every turn of every atom. This is all that there is. Right? And of that, what does any one person know? We who live life as if we walk halfway into a movie and leave before it's over. Right? That would be too big. But we talk like we know it all, right? Like we know maybe this much, or maybe even this much of reality. But we don't. And we recognize that. We know that. We only know a little bit of something. We try to figure out what we can figure out, but we can't know everything. So, if you don't know all that is, and if you are confronted, as human beings are, with the twin dynamics that are the ultimate problems of human existence, namely evil and death, and you don't know how to make your own existence last 1 second beyond your last breath, because if you did, you wouldn't have to win the lottery. People would be throwing money at you, right, to find out how to prolong, how to last into eternity. If you don't know how to conquer evil and death, then you better hope something or somebody does, because these are problems. These are problems. No matter what time in history you've lived in, no matter what political situation you've lived under, evil and death are going to affect you profoundly. In fact, everyone is born at a certain time and lives a certain period of life, long or short as it may be, and at a certain point dies, right? And maybe, in my case, I was about 7. At some point, you become aware of death. I had this little duck that was given to me for Easter one time, back when we still did that kind of thing. And we were the only house in the neighborhood, and it was all tall grass around us, and I went out walking with the duck. We were walking in the grass, and all of a sudden I felt this, and I heard this crunch. You know, it's my duck. I picked it up. I took it to my dad, who was busy fixing things in the garage, and Dad could fix anything. So I said to Dad, fix this. And it was very nice. He put the duck into a small, comfortable shoebox where it could die. And then I realized what death was, and that there was no second chance there. When it happened, it was over. And like everybody else who comes to an awareness of death, that moment, whenever it is, goes on to affect every choice and every decision that you make until you get to that point. Doesn't it? Why? Because we want this not ever to happen. Or if it does happen, we want it to happen as far away as possible. And so the governing dynamic that entire time is fear. Specifically fear of death. Right? And it is fear that leads people, human beings, to conclude that survival is the primary value in whatever ethical system they have, survival. And whatever else may come after that, peace, love, family, whatever it is, secondary and tertiary values in whatever ethical system you live in. If survival isn't met, then none of this other stuff matters, right? Now, if you don't know how to conquer evil and death, and someone comes along that you say is the definitive communication from the source of everything that is, there's the Logos. Like the preamble of the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Word was God. The Word is with God, the Word was God. By the Word, everything was made, and nothing that was made without it. The source, origin, the pattern of all that is. And you say that that person is Jesus, Son of Mary, who lived at a certain time. And as a Christian, you confess him to be fully human and fully divine. And you've got that communication from God, you've got that revelation that says how to conquer evil and death. And remember, the conquering of death is important because Christ is risen. Christ is risen. And the resurrection means our resurrection, or it means nothing at all. But because Christ is risen, survival is no longer a value. Because our survival is guaranteed. This is what we believe as Christians. Our survival is guaranteed. So if our survival is guaranteed, then there is nothing standing in the way of obeying what Jesus gives as his new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. So in the Christian moral universe, and we can look specifically at 1 Corinthians 13, for instance, martyrdom, speaking in languages, whatever, all morally worthless without love. All morally worthless without love. Love, Christian love, is the peak reality in the Christian moral universe. And so even the smallest deed of love, a cup of tea done in love, is, as St. John of the Cross would say, greater than a deed of real love is a greater deed than any act, any good deed, that all of them put together. Better for the individual and for the church. The micro deed of love is what it is that God, through Jesus Christ, is asking his followers to do. Now, unlike our president, Jesus seldom says, believe me. What he does say is, follow me. Now, if Jesus were simply another philosopher, a wise man, a spiritual leader, a teacher, then we would be free to choose to follow him or anybody else. And if he were simply God, an Olympian God who came out of nowhere and gave commandments and worked wonders and miracles and said, follow me, well, we'd have to shrug our shoulders and say, we can't. You're a God. We can't follow you. But if this Jesus is God and human, then not only can we follow him in our humanity, we must. We must. Because it is completely foolish to say that out of this little speck of knowledge that I have, versus what I'm learning from Jesus, from God's eye view on the whole thing, the teachings of Jesus are simply impractical. Impractical for what? One of the first things Constantine did, of course, was take over pagan temples and hand them to the Christians to be churches. And of course, if you're going to have property, you have to protect that property. And you need the organized homicidal violence of the state to do that. St. Constantine knew what he was doing. And we haven't gotten over it since then. If Jesus' teachings are impractical for what? For conquering evil and death? Come on. If they're impractical in terms of your being able to get ahead economically, to have a good life for you and yours, perhaps so. If they're impractical in terms of coming to political power and having authority over people, perhaps so. But if they're impractical in terms of living the destiny that God has created you to live, living the mission that God has given you, known or unknown, to be a follower of Jesus, to obey his commandments, and to teach others to do the same. Like Joshua, to recognize that if the Muslims can follow their book, we can follow ours, and they're going to be different. If Jesus is the Word of God, we dare not ignore what it is that he teaches us. And yet the church makes a practice of finding every excuse, every philosophical, theological, and ethical excuse to do everything but love as Christ has loved. And I'm no better at it than anybody else. This is not a matter of perfectionism. It's a matter of honesty. Because if I know what Jesus commands me and I fail to do it, then that's sin. And God has done something about sin through Jesus Christ. He forgives it. He heals it. He cures it. But if I say that I am following Jesus and then justify everything that contradicts Jesus, that's a different story altogether. So, I'm not perfect, and neither are you. We live in this atmosphere that's sodden with concupiscence and sin. And Jesus, God, through Jesus, invites everyone out of that to a more perfect way. If we are going to be simply the kind of people who say, before we start our project of oppressing the poor, let's begin with a prayer, then we can be the kinds of Christians that the world has come to expect us to be. And more than 82% of the world is not Christian, even though Christianity is the largest single religion in the world. And the numbers are not getting any better. But the world demands something better of us. God demands something better of us. And the trouble is, God gives us every means to accomplish it. Every means. It's a matter of being convinced. Even in our weakness and our failure, even in our perplexity and our sorrow, that this is the way to live a human life, the way that conquers evil and death. So that's my fervorino. I was explaining what a fervorino was. Excuse me. Not that okay, don't get this wrong. Don't take this out of context. He had the expression, never try to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and annoys the pig. I'm not saying that the Bishops' Conference is a pigsty. It's not. These are good and bright and holy men. But they are living with the same thing that bishop is living with. And if at some point they were touched by the Spirit of God in their hearts, and that's why they are where they are. Nobody becomes a bishop because, or at least better not be, because he wants power and authority and lots of money. And although that was probably a prerequisite at some points in the church's history. And so, but we're all wrestling with the same thing. How do you preach this? You know, in that thing about Father Colamaria, he said, if you got them, pack them, bring them to church. Be willing to kill that whatever son of a gun is going to kill you, right? Forgetting that means sacrilege. When you commit sacrilege in a church, when you shed blood in a church, that church has to be reconsecrated. Not to mention sacrilege of the real body, of the real temple of God, the real temple of the Holy Spirit. That's the human person. There are times when being a Christian ought to mean you love even when it costs you your life. Martyrdom in the first 3 centuries of the church was considered the ultimate act of social responsibility. Because they knew they were living a different way. They were living the way. Pagans observed that. They noticed that. And they were, and by the way, this is not to abandon yourself to fate or to, it is to plug yourself into the power of God. That's the idea. That the power of God is supreme in all of this. And that's what the New Testament that we're reading, the Gospels are full of that. The Acts of the Apostles are full of stories of healings. St. Peter, of course, they were lying in the streets for his shadow to fall on people so that they could be healed. And he runs into a beggar, and the beggar asks him for money, and he says, silver and gold I have none, but what I have I give you in the name of our Lord Jesus. In the name of Jesus, arise and walk, right? And a millennium and more later, St. Thomas Aquinas is at the Vatican with the Pope, and they're watching these caravans of goodies coming into the Vatican. Silks and gold and whatever. And the Pope says to Aquinas, St. Thomas, well, Peter can no longer say silver and gold that I have none. And St. Thomas said, neither can Peter say, arise and walk. We've lost sight that what we have behind us is this tremendous power. We're supposed to have it. We're supposed to be a channel of not only ethical goodness, but of the power that empties tombs, the power that heals. And if we're not that, perhaps the ways where we have to start looking is to what extent are we following Jesus in everything that he teaches, including a willingness to love when it hurts, to love, to serve without a desire for reciprocation, and to be injured without a desire for retaliation. That's what Christian love is. Because I'm as shot full of sin as anybody else, as we all are. I would just rather keep them to myself right now, if that's okay with you. That was one of the best advice I got from the Undersecretary of the Congregation for Eastern Churches back in the day. I started to tell him what a difficult time I was having. He said, leave your sins to the confessional, please don't tell me. So I've tried to do that. But like anybody else, but some better than others. They have their better moments and their worst moments. I'm a big fan of, I haven't gotten to visit them yet, but I'm looking forward to someday visiting the Bruderhof community, which is a newer Anabaptist community. But I grew up among Amish and Mennonites, and all we knew about them was that they were different. You had to slow down in the neighborhoods or you'd hit them, buggies. But wasn't it that long in this very state, that long ago, that some crazed individual went in and shot up a whole school full of Amish children? And what did they teach their other children? What did they do? They were explicit. They forgave. Because they knew that that's where the power of God is. was in that forgiveness. Not in a desire for revenge. Not even in a desire for some human concept of justice. What justice? Justice means to everyone their due, right? Well, who decides that? Who has access to your heart other than God? Sometimes not even you, right? Yeah. So what is due you? Well, St. Paul says, owe no one anything except to love one another. Because love is the fulfillment of the law. Love is ultimate justice. Love is what crosses the divide between pagan Roman justice, justitia, and Hebrew tzedakah, Old Testament righteousness. Because love seeks the good of the other. Even John F. Kennedy said, and I can't get the quote correctly, but he said, he said something to the effect that we know we would have arrived as a society when a conscientious objector is accorded the same respect as a soldier. And we are nowhere near that. But if somebody, holiness and the Kennedys never come to mind in the same sentence. As much as we may have liked him as a president or what have you, the Abbot of Portsmouth, it's famous for telling a friend of mine in Rhode Island, yes, we taught the Kennedys here. We tried to make gentlemen out of them, but they preferred to remain Kennedys. And that's how it is. That's the way power works, right? You know. Yes, we've been co-opted, I think, since the 4th century by militarism. So not just the church in the United States, but right now it's really egregious. Because we have a president who, I mean, maybe he's got access to wisdom that I don't have, but for some reason it seems wise to him to declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel and to move the American embassy there. Well, that was playing to his base, as they say. And that was a certain stripe of Christian evangelicals who are trying to hasten the apocalypse by bringing the restoration of Israel, according to their reading of the Bible. Now, believe me, as much as I honor those who seem to have a greater appreciation for the Scriptures than Catholics in general do, and at least a greater knowledge of it, it is possible to turn Holy Writ into a magic totem. And anyone who tries to predict the future out of the Bible, I think, is doing exactly that. That's not what it's there to do. So how do we escape from being militarized? President Eisenhower said, I don't care what you believe in as long as you believe in God, which is not acceptable to Christians, right? But we have somehow fallen into a particular American tolerant culture, which is in many respects very good. But we have found ourselves in the hands of an atheist capitalism that is more effective than atheist communism in exterminating the faith. Don't you think? Materialist capitalism. Because when communism fell in Romania, for instance, the first thing to come back was the church. Now, can you imagine that happening here? We already have churches. We've got churches galore. When Hoover got bought by Maytag and Maytag got bought by some outfit in China, then North Canton practically shut down. Because that was where I'm from, the home of the Hoover Company. But right now, their big new warehouse is Faith Family Church. Joel Osteen needs a football stadium to pack with his parishioners. It's not that we're not marketing Jesus as well as some others do. But yet it's their vision of Jesus and not particularly scriptural, I don't think. Not that I know them that well, and I don't mean any disrespect, because I don't know them. It's ecumenically impolite of me to sound like I'm criticizing them for their religion, so I don't want to do that. Of all crazy things, they asked me to, and I am. I'm the Catholic co-chair of the Dialogue with the Episcopal Church now in the United States. Can you imagine? What does this hunky from Canton, Ohio know about the Episcopal Church? But I'm trying to learn, and I find that we can get along very well, because even though we're not going to get together anytime soon for all kinds of reasons, where we're finding common ground is the role that Christians have in inserting the very notion of reconciliation into civil society. And there's something we can do that can maybe that can account for participation in civil society without being co-opted and bought out by the military-industrial complex, or as Eisenhower originally wrote it before he edited his text, military-industrial congressional complex. Was Jesus crucified because they didn't like his morality? He was a threat to the Roman Empire and to the Herodian state in a lot of ways. So the fact is that when we're talking about humans living together, there's always a moral component. And if the state exists to serve justice, and that's its primary responsibility, and we observe systemic injustice, we have to say something about it. You can call it politics if you want. But even the U.S. Catholic bishops refer to the budget, for instance, as a moral document. And it is, because it says what we're interested in. And of course, these latest attempts at budget and tax so-called reform are abominable. But a Christian anarchist would tell you, all taxes are confiscatory. Right? Right. Christian anarchism is here, libertarianism is here. You know, very close opposites in some ways, and I'm trying to sort that out myself. I could hardly consider myself a libertarian. And I don't really mind paying taxes for the things that I support. But, and this might get me in trouble, I don't understand the difference between paying taxes for bullets and bombs that will kill babies and paying into an insurance premium where somebody might use it to purchase contraception. I fail to see that yet, and I shouldn't. And I pay taxes because I'm a wimp, and I'm celibate. And people that I know with lots of kids can get away with not paying taxes because, or up till now. But a single person, you end up having to pay something. And I have not had the courage of my convictions to stop paying money for taxes. I bet there are people in here who do not pay taxes. And I congratulate you and respect you for your witness. Well, prudence is a theological virtue, right? So there is something, a lot to be said for prudence. Again, maybe why I don't speak up as often as I should. But there's not that much that I have to address lately. If you perhaps haven't noticed, the USCCB has not done much lately. Because we got really negatively self-critical, and I think properly so, that we were busy issuing dozens of documents that nobody read. So we kind of backed off from that, and now it's just becoming interesting again, where there are actually sides beginning to form, So, but everyone is trying to be prudent, and prudence, it takes a lot of prudence to be prudent, because I think it was, Merton said something like prudence and discernment are often used as euphemisms for laziness and cowardice. Something like that. And so when I think I'm being prudent, I step back, and at 3 o'clock in the morning I realize I'm being a lazy coward. Yes, it is well when the priests are dying with the people who are dying. We're doing pretty well at being with our people when we're rich. When the people are rich, we're rich. When the people are with the military, we're with the military. Moral leadership perhaps is not what it could be. And Father Colavita says, bring your guns to church. And the Pope has an army also. They contacted the author of this, contacted the Diocese of Brooklyn and says, we have no policy against people bringing guns to church. So, tricky business. Now I thought, okay, I'm going to issue a policy. You're not allowed to bring guns to church. And I'm going to tell the parishioner there in the 10th pew from the front, who's the sheriff, In my county, not to bring a gun to church, but, you know, he won't. He'll stay where his gun is, though. And it won't be in church. We've cooked a good one for ourselves the last 1700. I don't know because, and perhaps he doesn't care. But if I were the sheriff, if I were in that world, I would know that there are lots of people out there trying to get me. And they could walk into church anytime, once they found out where I went to church. But you live, this is the way we live according to the logic of whatever system has us. And right now, we're in this culture, in this time of history, with this country, and in this political, system, if you want to call it that. Right now it seems more chaotic than systematic. And we operate mostly unconsciously out of the logic that's built into this system, not out of the logic that comes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Well, there's no better, to me, there would be no better place to die than in the church, because you have the priests, the sacraments, everything there. I mean,
that's right. And then we have to go and reconsecrate the church. You know, the last time I did that, it took 4.5 hours. No, we'd have a saint praying for us while we were doing it, Pat. So I wouldn't. I wonder. He did say something. There was a conference last year. That was a peace conference that was mainly Cardinal Turkson's work, but mainly also the community of Sant'Egidio and a few other groups that had this conference. And it sort of got Vatican backing, and then became kind of a Vatican thing. And the Pope did come to that. And he used the term nonviolence. He also, very recently, at another conference, also with Cardinal Turkson at the Vatican, by a group called something Zero. I forget. But it's a disarmament group, a nuclear disarmament group. He said for the first time what nobody has said in terms of official Catholic teaching, that even the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. And that's a step in the right direction. Now, if he were to say, if he were to preach like Peter preached, that would be awesome. And the Swiss Guard would find themselves out of a job, and the Vatican would be putting up new luxury hotels for rich Romans and other people, and there would no longer be a state, and we would have to be prepared for a lot of changes. And I think that would be fine, but it would be quite an adjustment for Catholics who are not used to that.
Right here, make sure I say something, Bishop. You just did more to explain myself to me than I've heard in a very long time. And I really thank you for that. I think we all heard something tonight. We were called to think, how seriously do we believe what we have been told and what we tell others? And if we weigh this on our conscience, help us remove the limitations that we've imposed on ourselves to truly be able to follow you. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Hang out.